All right, Belinda Fecky. So Belinda Fecky has done an incredible amount of activism for low carbohydrate diets. Now, I don't even actually know the full story behind her husband Gary Fecky. Belinda runs a website called, is it I Support
I
Gary?
support Gary. I support Gary.com. Um, I don't think the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, the medical board, expected me to start an actual website campaigning against their decision to silence my husband from speaking out about the harms of sugar and processed foods. Gary's an orthopedic surgeon in Tasmania, and not only has his health been very poor in 2000, he was diagnosed with a pituitary tumor, and so he had major surgery, stereotactic radiotherapy, and chemotherapy. In 2004, he had more surgery, and by 2009, they said there was nothing more they could do. The chemo couldn't hold it, and so this is his journey into looking at what else can I do here. And so he found out about sugar. His PET scan in 2000 lit up like a Christmas tree to glucose.
Wow.
And no one had ever said anything to him about maybe consider your diet, maybe think about what you're eating. And I think chemo drives more of a hunger for sugar as well, which is interesting.
Mm.
So Gary was a sugar addict, glucose addict, in that he had a lot of carbohydrates. He was eating a lot of breads, pastas, cereal, juice, all sorts of things that were probably feeding this cancer and couldn't control it despite the chemo. And when he went on a low sugar diet,
Yeah.
he found that his cancer was going into remission. So after a year of being in nutritional ketosis, um, which is low sugar processed foods, it's a low glucose load, and using ketone bodies to fuel instead of glucose.
Yeah, yeah. We've talked about to a lot of guys like Andrew Scarborough. We've talked to Dominic D'Agostino several times on the
Yeah,
channel
it
here.
was
So
Dominic D'Agostino that Gary spoke to about it at the beginning. So Gary's actually been off all chemotherapy for 5 years, and his tumor is in complete remission.
wow,
Hasn't gone away, but it's in remission. And so for him, diet has been incredible, and he's been able to come off over 10 medications. But
wow.
it didn't take long for him to start to think, I've got a tsunami of people with type 2 diabetes complications, and type 1 as well, but mostly type 2. They're requiring amputations of bits of their feet, um, and even lower legs. Before Christmas in 2016, he saw 7 people who had ulcers on their feet and lower legs that were uncontrolled and would need surgery. And from 10 years ago, when you might see 1 or 2 people a year, this is it's a horrific condition in Tasmania right now. And he started working with his patients, thinking, well, diabetes type 2, especially when you eat carbohydrates, if you don't eat carbohydrates, you potentially don't need your medication. You potentially don't need all these things. It doesn't have to be a chronic progressive disease, as we've been told,
Right.
if you drop the sugar and carbohydrates. So as a doctor, this was a really important message for him to learn himself and then to see in his patients. And he became an outspoken advocate for reducing sugar and carbohydrates because of his patients that he was looking after. And then he started talking louder in the community. When he was reported to the Medical Board of Tasmania for telling people in hospitals to reduce their sugar by a dietitian, by a dietitian at the hospital, um, he had maybe 5,000 people following him on social media at the time. Yeah, we've got a catchment area of 120,000 people. We're at the very bottom of the world. We're so far away from everything else. And the expert witness in Gary's case was an emeritus professor of Southeast Asia Pacific region in nutrition. Like, we're talking the biggest gun in nutrition was called into Gary's case to decide whether he could tell people to reduce sugar or not. I thought my alarm bell started to ring and think, this is really odd. So when the board, that was a star chamber investigation for 2.5 years. His right of reply was only via email. They'd twist his message, they'd misconstrue it, send back more, you need to answer this, you need to answer that. And when I discovered that the expert witness in Gary's case was working for Sanitarium, which is a processed breakfast cereal company in Australia, wholly owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and as such, they pay no tax. When I found that this expert witness had worked for Sanitarium, I thought, well, maybe this is where it's a cereal company, so the anti-carbohydrate, the low carbohydrate message Gary was putting out there was probably conflicting with the cereal messaging that Sanitarium was promoting, and I would say impacting on their bottom line. So they brought in, not Sanitarium necessarily, but the Dietitians Association, APRA brought in this big gun to silence Gary. And when his determination came about in November 2016, he was told that even if low carbohydrate healthy fat principles became accepted best practice, he was never allowed to talk about it. And his caution was lifelong and non-appealable. So we have fought for that. That was a 2.5-year investigation where he couldn't be on social media.
Who tells people that they're never allowed to talk about this, even if it becomes the standard of care and accepted?
The Medical Board of Australia told Gary he was never allowed to talk about it. So for the last 2 years, so I started a website, I Support Gary. I thought, this is ridiculous.
I've got their website pulled up right below for everybody to see, isupportgary.com.
So I've talked about Gary's story. I've talked about the issues we've had with the hospital system, which certainly ganged up on Gary. There was a lot of mobbing. The Dietitians Association of Australia actually wrote or the CEO of the Dietitians Association back in 13 and 14, wrote to the then CEO of the Launceston General Hospital where Gary was working, pretty much effectively telling them to silence him. So within weeks of that second letter from the Dietitians Association, a dietitian at the hospital reported him to the medical board. So we think this has been a targeted campaign. And because it was non-appealable, I went to the public. I thought, the public can be my jury. Let's see what people think about how my husband's been treated and this ridiculous ruling that was put onto him. So for 2 years, we've fought very publicly because we couldn't appeal it through the courts. Mm-hmm. And we went to see the National Health Ombudsman here in Australia. And for 2 years, she was looking into Gary's case because she was able to consider failed process. So if she considered there was something wrong with the process that Gary had been investigated by and his determination, she could question and send it back to APRA, which is what happened. Of course, the Tasmanian APRA board said, there's nothing wrong, we've done nothing wrong, send it back. And she's gone, well, actually, I think there is. She sent it to an independent medical board, and within 6 weeks, it was completely thrown out. So Gary was pretty much subjected to 4.5 years of our community, the medical community, personally, professionally, and financially. It's cost us so much for him, and then it all seems like it was all set up. So my website talks about what I started to look into because I thought, well, why is he being silenced from advocating this? And so I've gone down a lot of rabbit holes looking into the evolution of our plant-based dietary guidelines, because I worked out Gary wasn't just in trouble for talking about low carbohydrate, reducing sugar. He's actually in trouble for talking about advocating animal proteins and fats. And that was something we never, ever considered. So on my website, I delve into a whole lot of things. If people want to hear about the science behind low carbohydrate healthy fat, Gary's actually got an abandoned website at the moment because he's been too busy doing everything else. But nofructose.com, and he talks about the science. I'm much more about the vested interests and the ideology that have shaped these guidelines. And I guess that's where this Eat Lancet commission report has come into my vision and working through that. But it's really interesting, Tristan.